Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'd like to begin the event now. Thanks to all of our staff that have put this together. I'd like to welcome each of you to this webinar, which is sponsored by the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, or 3CT. 3CT is a place at the University of Chicago that has for over a decade been at the forefront of thinking about contemporary political conditions, working to think analytically, politically, with imagination about the state of the world as we find it in and as we wish it to be. And with that in mind, we have an excellent talk coming today. I'm, of course, speaking from my home office, and I hope, as you probably are as well, I hope you're staying healthy and also steady in this rather crazy political moment that we find ourselves in the United States right now. Before I do the introduction, let me just say that we've got a couple rules for the webinar. They're pretty straightforward. Each of you that's in the audience, you're muted and we can't see your faces, but you will be able to ask questions through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. You can type in your questions as you think of them, and when we get to the Q&A period, I will read them and our speaker will respond. So that's the kind of basic guidelines for the event. Let me say hello and introduce myself. I'm Joe Mosco, and along with Lisa Wedeen, I co-direct the Conspiracy/Theory project at 3CT. The Conspiracy/Theory project has been a multi-year project to think seriously about the epistemological terms of our moment and the problems of disinformation, the kind of compelling force of narratives, the problems of identifying the origins of harm in a world of global capitalism, global militarism, and environmental disruption. And so we've been thinking a lot over the last few years about how people explain what they're feeling about the conditions of the moment, the narratives they turn to, the things that capture them in their efforts to understand what's happening to them, and the broader kind of political climate of the 21st century. So with this in mind, I'm really delighted to welcome back to 3CT Dr. Joan Donovan. Joan is the research director of the Shorenstein Center for Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard University. She is an expert on internet and technology studies, online extremism, media manipulation, and disinformation campaigns. We had an event with her last year, which was quite marvelous, where she walked us through how certain campaigns emerged on the web, the origins of memes and the way in which they recruit people into using them, and the force of kind of repetition in narrative, the way in which people come to feel that they understand things and they might not know exactly how they came to understand them. And it was a masterpiece of kind of the detailed work of how somebody might set up one of those campaigns online and the particular theories of the mind that are behind them. Joan is highly active these days across major media platforms, and is also a kind of, to my mind, like the most serious online activist, both protecting the liberatory capacities of the web, while also addressing the consolidation of hate online directly and powerfully. I'm happy to report that Joan Donovan's and Aaron Panofsky's 2019 essay entitled Genetic Ancestry Testing Among White Nationalists from Identity Repair to Citizen Science, which was published in the Science Studies Journal, Social Studies of Science, was a few weeks ago awarded the David Edge Prize from the Society for the Social Studies of Science as like kind of the top article in our field. So congratulations, Joan, that was a wonderful achievement. But, you know, I think for many of you, if you were watching the New York Times this morning and you happen to come across Farhad Manjoo's column, in which he describes a conversation that he had with Joan. And I think the technical scientific term is that Joan scared the hell out of him about the state of our democracy and what's happening online. He concluded his column today by writing, quote, and concluding that combating the deception that has overrun public discourse should be a primary goal of our society. Otherwise, America ends in lies, unquote. But I'm happy to actually say that Joan Donovan is fully on the case, and her project at the Shorenstein Center is providing the tools for you to be on the case as well. And you can visit mediamanipulation.org for her team's recent insights about addressing media manipulation and disinformation campaigns, but we're also going to hear about these themes today. Joan's talk is entitled The True Costs of Misinformation, Producing Moral and Technical Order in a Time of Pandemonium. So usually at this moment, I would have everybody clapping riotously to welcome Joan to the stage. But in our online format, I will just turn the microphone over to Joan and also express my thanks for her doing this today.
Well,
so thanks, Joan.
Thank you so much for the wonderful intro. I'm very excited to be here. I tried to weave some anthropology into the presentation tonight just to, just to spice it up. I hate doing the same thing over and over. So this is actually a brand new lift in terms of a presentation. So I would love feedback, and it kind of ends on an ellipsis. So it's one of those types of things, but anthropologists pretty used to that. So, society goes on. I'm going to share my screen here and present a slide deck with many different pictures. I tried to keep it as least wordy as possible. Before I get going, Joe, what time do you want me to wrap it up?
Oh, we have a good amount of time. You can go for 40 minutes or so, or whatever seems right to you.
All right.
Yeah.
I could go on forever. You know me. So let's and you can see my slides okay? Looks good?
Yeah, they're coming through well. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. I won't keep interrupting you. You can go back to watching YouTube. So welcome everybody. Very excited to be here, and very timely in the sense that we produced our big crowning project for the year. A lot of people, get into doing research. They think I should write a book. What I really wanted to do was make a resource and a living website for the fields of critical internet studies, so that people can learn and grow with this field as new ideas emerge. We want to be the place that people come to for more cutting edge research. And that has to do with an ethic of care that me and my team have towards not just serving an academic community, but also serving journalists, policymakers, technologists, civil society organizers, and the broad public. And of course, I know that's a trapdoor, so I'm not going to try to just explain what the public means to anybody. And today I'm going to be talking about the true costs of misinformation, which I presented some of this argument in front of Congress last week. And I'll review sort of where that fits in as well. I'm going to go over a few definitions before we get started, which is when we talk about media on our team, we're talking about an artifact of communication. So your basic comms 101 definition of media. When we talk about news organizations, we say that, but media tends to be the ephemera, or the things left behind that we can then study as pieces, or as in our case, mostly digital traces, although some of it shows up in public space as well. Then we separate out the term manipulation, which means to us to change by artful or unfair means so as to serve one's purpose. I have a piece in Scientific American a couple weeks ago about truth activism, and that in that piece, I detail the early history of media manipulation and hoaxing. And surprise, surprise, it comes from activists in very interesting ways. And so happy to share the link to that article later. And today we're going to talk a bit about disinformation, which is the creation and distribution of intentionally false information for political ends. Right. So I'm sure you've been paying attention. There's a lot of disinformation out there. Some of it feels like we're living through maybe like in a, Home Alone Part 5 or something where there's just shenanigans on top of shenanigans. But by and large, most of the disinformation that we look at and study is discovered by journalists, sometimes by other law enforcement and people that are tasked with picking up the wreckage of a disinformation campaign. And then platform companies or social media companies step in sometimes in order to try to mitigate. But by and large, journalists are at the front lines discovering, documenting, and debunking disinformation campaigns as they fly across our online worlds. Also want to talk a bit about the moment that we're in and why it's important to think about the pandemic as a different kind of context for carrying out your life. Pan meaning all, demos, demic, meaning all of the people in common, of diseases, widespread. And I bring your attention to this because one of the fissures in the social context of this moment is really trying to understand how the pandemic brought global attention into the same place where people wanted to know more about coronavirus, COVID-19. And when you concentrate both information, and Joe made a really good point about when you consolidate information, and then you concentrate society's attention on a very small piece of that, it becomes a play space for grifters, hoaxers, hackers, all kinds of different foreign and domestic operatives. And so you could take the pandemic itself and look at all of the different ways in which medical misinformation, media manipulation, and disinformation created this very toxic cloud in which we are now still living. We have not emerged from it, and it's going to take a long time to get where we're going. So my wife's tired of this joke, but I call it pandemonium. And I call it pandemonium because pan, again, meaning all, but then demonium is evil spirit, borrowed from the Greek, divine power, inferior divine being, root word of daemon. And the reason why I think pandemonium is an apt description for this moment is really encapsulated in the example of Zoom bombing. So it did arrive a bit like a moral panic in a way. People were rushing to figure out how they were going to reorganize their social lives. And lo and behold, there's a technology just waiting for us all to make it our home. And very few guardrails had been put into the design of the system because it was a B2B system. It was for business owners. It was for people to talk to their employees. It wasn't necessarily set up. And I'm talking about Zoom meetings, not necessarily the webinar software, which we're using today. But it wasn't really set up with robust gates and passwords and protections on people's privacy. So we wrote a little description of that moment because our team really wanted to mark it as something very unique that has happened between our online lives and how moral and technical order were reestablished, where Zoom bombing was something that younger folks, they'd get a link to their classroom. And I know I sound like an old person being like, and then young Zoomers, but they would get these links, they'd put them in their chat rooms, and they would laugh like crazy when, someone from one of these chat rooms showed up in their classroom and disrupted their teacher. However, something more sinister was also happening. It wasn't all pranking and fun and games. Although there were some hilarious clips, I have to say. Some of them were recording what they were doing. They were uploading them to YouTube. One of them came in and said to the professor, hey, listen, all my other professors give me an A if I just pay $3,000. Can I just do that? Can we just arrange that right now? So, there was quite a bit of shenanigans, but what ended up rising to the level of public consciousness and people really wanted to have something done. They wanted the technology changed because racist and sexist and misogynist content was starting to interrupt um, in more personal style meetings. We saw the targeting of LGBTQ youth groups, the targeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, the targeting of mental health groups. And in that sense, the fun and games were over. And it took a bunch of reporters as well as other security specialists over at Citizen Lab in Toronto to write up quite a few articles and spend quite a few resources in their own time pointing out the holes and the brokenness of that product as society continued to adopt it. And now, for the most part, Zoom bombing is a bit of a relic of the past, but it still happens every once in a while when a human introduces a vulnerability, not necessarily the technology being as open as it used to be. And so I call your attention to that because I have a great report with Brian Friedberg and Gabrielle Lim, co-researchers of mine. And if you want to relive that moment and understand more about it, it's available on our new website at mediamanipulation.org. So when I'm talking about moral and technical order, I'm drawing from the research of Chris Kelty, who's at UCLA. He talks in his book, Two Bits, The Cultural Significance of Free Software, about geeks. And he talks about the ways in which geeks organize society by building technology. And he writes that geeks fashion together both technology, principally software, hardware, networks, and protocols, and an imagination of the proper order of collective political and commercial action, that is, of how economy and society should be ordered collectively. And I call your attention to that because one of the things I really want to understand is related to how then do we end up with not internet infrastructure, but platform infrastructure. So social media platforms like Twitter and YouTube and Facebook. And to some degree, our internet infrastructure in relationship to cookies and other tracking devices put into websites. How do we end up with what I write about in a paper with Anthony Nadler and Matt Crane as the digital influence machine? And that is the infrastructure of data collection and targeting capacities developed by ad platforms, web publishers, and other intermediaries, which includes consumer monitoring, audience targeting, and automated technologies that enhance its reach and ultimately its power to influence. Right? I think that we have to start to understand more about the ways in which platforms, as they are designed, are about shifting influence. And for some time, social movements had a first mover advantage. They were really out the gate, had adopted the technology quickly, and were really pushing at the sides of it to try to see how far they could bend it. I'm not talking about hacking. I'm talking about looking at what its possible use case is. And then through extension or enhancement, adding in other potential political opportunities. For instance, when the moment when a movement figures out that by adding a bunch of people into the conversation through a hashtag, they are able to influence trending algorithms and even search returns. That is part of understanding moral and technical order in a way that platform companies may even not have thought were possible. And we see that with Zoom bombing. Zoom was never set up to think, oh, well, you are going to have a massive pandemic where everyone's going to need to use our technology, and a bunch of hoaxsters, pranksters, and then violent misogynists and racists are going to leverage it to their advantage. So we have to think about how those things are co-constructed and who is making those technologies. And we also have to ask, well, who pays for social media? One of the big issues at play in this field is really about the products, of course, there's this old adage, you know, if the product is free, the product is you. I don't really think that's the case. I think that the product wouldn't exist in the way that it exists, and it wouldn't be as big and overscaled as it is if the product cost money. Because when you are a consumer, you can make different kinds of demands on the product. And you do make different cost benefit analyses and decide, do I want this product or that product? I know during the pandemic, every one of you parents that are paying for that Disney Plus, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You know, you could have just gotten away with Netflix. You decided to have kids. That's on you. But what I'm saying is we do make those decisions. But for many, many years, you know, since we've had social media, it's been quote unquote free. And one of the more interesting ways in which then this product has shown its value to the public is by coming into service for political communication, not just social movements, but politicians. And so in October 2019, Mark Zuckerberg said in a speech, "I don't think it's right for a private company to censor politicians in a democracy." I think many of us could probably get behind that statement. Yeah, I don't think it's right for politicians to censor in a democracy. Sure. Yeah, that sounds all right. But then when you look at actually what's happening on these platforms and how people who are political elites, people with resources, are leveraging these products to blanket the public and even target specific groups with medical misinformation, with political disinformation, then we have to wonder, is this about censorship or is this about profits? Is this about scale? And what you would need to do to redesign the technology and what that would end up doing to moral and technical order? And later in January 2020, Facebook publishes a new policy about its platform, probably one of the most significant policies to date. They say, in the absence of regulation, Facebook and other companies are left to design their own policies. We have based ours on the principle that people should be able to hear from those who wish to lead them, warts and all. And a statement like that, to me, if we're thinking through this framework of moral and technical order, that's not really about the politicians. That's about us. That's about society. It's about pushing the responsibility for responsibility for raw power, raw political power onto the public. And in other times, you know, the before times and Game of Thrones times, no, I'm just kidding. You know, in the before times, you had different kinds of media gatekeepers. There were ways in which you could produce accountability for politicians and people who have enormous amounts of resources. But for right now, these platforms, particularly Facebook and their advertising systems, and YouTube to a very big degree, are being blanketed with political propaganda. Some of it lies, some of it spin, some of it false association between politicians and their own platforms. And so there's some great research out there that I recommend out of Berkman. There's going to be a new report out of Berkman, I think either tonight or tomorrow, about disinformation in the US primaries. And their report from last week really looked at how did the idea that the 2020 election is rigged, how did that permeate all of American media? How did everybody end up having to confront that story and clean up the mess made by what is essentially a white propaganda campaign, the collusion between Trump, the RNC, Fox News, and conservative talk radio, who essentially said it so many times that it made everybody else have to react and have to shield their communities and their audiences against this kind of voter depression effort or voter deterrence effort where people think their vote doesn't matter anyway because it is rigged. So how do we study media manipulation? I'm going to go through this pretty fast because I want to get to some case studies, but I want to let you know that on our mediamanipulation.org website is this method where we use what's called the life cycle approach. We look at 5 points of action in every media manipulation campaign. The first is we look at media manipulation campaign planning and its origins. The second, we look at seeding the campaign across social platforms and web. The third stage, we look at responses by industry, activists, politicians, and journalists. This is the make or break moment for most media manipulation campaigns. If nobody responds, if it doesn't get uptake, if people don't think it's significant, if you don't trigger a politician or some other newsworthy individual to say something or to share it, then it tends to die at that point. The media manipulation campaign will winnow away, and maybe there's going to be an adaptation and another attempt. Fourth stage is something that's very difficult for us to study because mitigation sometimes is hidden by the platforms. We have one case study on our casebook right now where platform companies never told anybody that they had started to hide the hashtag and hide the search term and scrub content from the platforms. Actually, we have 2 case studies on that. Interesting. And the reason why I call attention to that is because I think that this is where the field needs to go. I think the field needs to understand mitigation before we can start to push for policy. And then lastly, we look at the adjustments by media manipulators to the new information environment. So if the mitigation deleted accounts or things of that nature, then do they just register a bunch of new accounts? Do they change the campaign? How do they adapt to the situation? So I want to talk a bit about who pays for misinformation. If we know that social media is free and they're making money through advertising and there's a gigantic profit model, it's Siva Varadarajan in his book Anti-Social Media talks about it as essentially that the advertising system on some of these platforms is a lot like an ATM machine. But we haven't really had a lot of attention to, well, who has to clean up this mess? When misinformation touches down in small communities, when it starts to change the conversation between doctors and their patients, who is to shoulder that burden? Who is to provide those resources? So at the hearing on misinformation, conspiracy theories, and infodemics, challenges and opportunities for stopping their spread online, before the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, I made this argument that I'm going to represent here. Which is essentially that journalists, public health professionals, civil society leaders, law enforcement, these are the people who pay for misinformation. These are the people who pay for misinformation at scale. It's not the case that we're dealing with a neighborhood or a few people that are deluded or, we are dealing with conspiracy at scale, which is different from dealing with an individual or even a fairly large group that believes something that is based on an untruth. And sometimes conspiracies are not harmful and people have questions. It's okay to ask about the collusion and the corruption in government. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about things that have grown unabated, unmoderated, and grown to such a capacity that people are starting to show up in public space and do things differently. And I'll describe that in a couple of examples from the casebook. Journalists, for instance, when the Parkland shooting happened, journalists, as well as the rest of us, all on the same internet, including law enforcement, were scrambling to figure out what had happened. We wanted to know. And what we knew as researchers is that the minute a name was announced, there was going to be a mad dash to get this person's social media, because we all knew that social media companies were going to try to take it down. And so when we were thinking about, okay, well, what's happening here as a research institute, how do we understand this? One thing that caused an enormous information cascade and hundreds of articles were written that had to be debunked. Someone on an anonymous message board, which you all probably know by now is 4chan, posted a picture of a young man with his face covered, claiming it was Nicholas Cruz and that he was a member of the Republic of Florida militia. And this piece of quote unquote evidence, which was a troll campaign, got picked up by journalists because a researcher with the ADL had agreed on record with a journalist that they believed that this was in fact Nikolas Cruz. And so once one outlet starts reporting on it, there starts to be a cascade effect. All of these journalists read each other. It eventually trickled, but it traded up the chain from this anonymous message board all the way up to national cable media. And over time, people realized that they had been hoaxed, and journalists had to issue hundreds of retractions. And so not only did the story not need to be produced and the resources not need to be wasted, but also the debunks were a waste of time and resources for journalists who, by and large, have had to build what's now a misinformation beat, right? There are now many journalists across newsrooms, across America, across the globe that are tasked with dealing with misinformation at scale that happens as a result of the way in which social media is designed. Public health professionals. The tactic of distributed amplification is really important here. The Plandemic, quote unquote, documentary was put together with a communication strategy in mind. They made a website, they uploaded the movie so that anybody could download it. And there were a set of instructions that said very clearly, we know this is going to get taken down from social media. And so it had what Molly Sauter calls the aura of illicit information. And so when they uploaded it to social media, they knew it would trigger journalists to cover it because journalists had been covering content moderation issues. The documentary made several very dangerous claims, one of which had to do with the vaccine, another had to do with the masks. And it starred what anybody who was in the anti-vaccination world knew was a well-known activist who was a disgraced scientist. But by having a place for this video to be downloaded, it brought everybody along with it that downloaded it and then re-uploaded it to their own social media. So people were trying to re-upload it to YouTube, upload it to Facebook, and other video platforms. And this produced an enormous amount of chaos for platform companies who thought it was going to be relatively easy to take down misinformation. But because they haven't built the guardrails and because it's very difficult for them to communicate with one another, this documentary is still readily available online. And every once in a while, there's a flashpoint where we see it be shared quite a few times. Where this touches down in public space, though, is really interesting because when you go and you watch videos of reopen protests, you see an uncomfortable alliance between anti-vaxxers, people who follow the QAnon conspiracy and use this term plandemic, and militiamen. And this is a really important confluence as we think about pandemonium, right? That these evils are now in a place where they're scared. You know, when I say evils, I want to be careful not to talk about, I'm not talking about people, I'm talking about the evils of these ideas that people are going to need to take up arms against the government, that they're going to have to shoot their way out of a doctor's office because they're going to be coming at them with microchipped vaccines, right? These kinds of ideas, when you allow them to scale and you allow them to percolate in the way that they have, they take hold because people are very isolated, because there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of mistrust right now. And I think some of it is aptly placed. But in this moment, we have to understand that public health professionals are the ones that have to clean up after all of this. Public health professionals are the ones that are left to have to deal with scared mothers and people who are believing that wearing a mask is going to make them even sicker. Civil society. This is one of my favorite case studies because it has this reference. One of the trolls that was doing what we call a butterfly attack, where you mimic the patterns of behavior of another group of individuals so as to seem like you belong, and then eventually try to pull a hoax. For a while, there was an Operation Blacksit which is Black Exit, where people were trying to masquerade as Black people online, and the trolls were amazed at how well it worked, how well they were able to blend in. Of course, this didn't last very long. It did not last as long as they wanted it to, but for a while they were getting a lot of attention, and they were able to generate quite a bit of discussion online, and were able to seep into the background. There have been several other campaigns, media manipulation campaigns like this, including trolls pretending to be Black feminists online, as well as trolls pretending to be, most recently, Black Trump supporters. And I say trolls here, but it could be any number of different kinds of people, some paid or unpaid. And that's really one of the things that's very difficult about this field, is that sometimes it's just purely for the grift. It's, you're trying to drive people to a website. You've got a bunch of ads on the website, or you're trying to get people to give you their personal information. So you claim that you're selling hand sanitizer and masks or health insurance. And then other times it's more politically motivated, more ideologically motivated. And then lastly, law enforcement. So this is something that is really hard to get data on, but we're starting to see the echoes and the resonance online of different law enforcement agencies realizing that they are wasting time, energy, and resources on trying to investigate rumors. Most notably, there were a rash of fake Antifa accounts that were put online in 2017. This tactic has been around for quite some time. And so, unfortunately, even in the most heinous of circumstances with the wildfires on the West Coast, there was an incident that was circulating using the hashtag Antifa fires, where even the FBI had to issue a tweet and say, please stop calling. The rumors are untrue. Antifa is not setting fires. And we know that law enforcement right now are prepping for potential violence at the polls that is going to be, and it's potentially going to come from hoaxes and scams and media manipulation operations that begin online. We saw one yesterday where there was an email spoof that made it look like voters in Florida and Alaska that were registered with the Democratic Party were getting emails making it look as if the Proud Boys were harassing them and had claimed that they had their voter information and were trying to intimidate them into voting a different way. As the next few days roll out, it's going to be interesting to see if there's any way to lay the blame for a media manipulation campaign like that at the feet of any particular kind of hacker. And so it's important that we understand, though, that the true costs of misinformation are not necessarily solely shouldered by platform companies who have to make these trade-offs between moral and technical order. What Pandemonium has taught Zuckerberg, as well as Jack Dorsey, as well as the folks over at Google, is that these decisions in design are not arbitrary, that the choices they make to keep up hate speech, including Holocaust denial, the choices they make to keep up inciting posts and events that incite violence, that shows up and touches down in Kenosha. The choices they make to leave up medical misinformation is going to kill people. And so we have to ask these companies, first, start now. And then the second thing we have to do, and I'll close on this point, is we have to regulate them. And I have some ideas of where this should go, but it's really just a frame for now. I wrote for the MIT Tech Review earlier this month an article called "Thank You for Posting." And it is a way of thinking about medical misinformation, or way of thinking about misinformation in broad terms, like secondhand smoke, because we weren't going to get regulation on cigarettes and tobacco by arguing that people were harming themselves. People have a right to harm themselves, according to many of the policymakers that I've spoken to about this error. But secondhand smoke is your choice affects me. It affects public space. It actually degrades the quality of public space. So I wrote this piece, and I'd like to close with thinking through this this problem here with, like secondhand smoke, misinformation damages the quality of public life. Every conspiracy theory, every propaganda or disinformation campaign affects people. And the expense of not responding can grow exponentially over time. Since the 2016 US election, newsrooms, technology companies, civil society organizations, politicians, educators, and researchers have been working to quarantine the viral spread of misinformation. The true costs have been passed on to them and to the everyday folks who rely on social media to get news and information. So I want to thank you for listening to my presentation today and recognize the labor of my research team, Brian Friedberg, Gabby Lim, Emily Dreyfus, Rob Ferris, Nicole Lever, and Jen Nilsson, who have been extraordinary thought partners as we built out this website and welcome participation and collaboration within it. So if you have ideas for case studies and you want to work them out, please be in touch. So thank you. I'm going to stop my share here. We're good.
Excellent. Thank you, Joan. We have a couple questions in the Q&A box already, and people can continue to add their questions, and I'll get to them quickly. I wondered if you could just as a way of kind of starting the question and answer period, think a little bit about, what's different about the 21st century about disinformation campaign than the long 20th century, in the sense that we have, I come out of questions around national security politics and the idea of disinformation, of information campaigns as kind of a domain of international competition was pretty well established. We had, a former director of communications for the CIA in the late 50s who talked about American media as his mighty Wurlitzer organ because he could make it play any tune he wanted. And this idea that our mass media has been kind of connected to and subject to manipulation by state forces is something that has a history in the 20th century and is kind of like at the core of mass media theory itself, like how it is that mass communication happens. But it seems to me that what you've just described today is something of a different order of magnitude in the 21st century, and some of it is definitely the power of technological revolution. But I wondered if you have a kind of way of thinking about what's different about our moment now than earlier moments where we were, as readers, as viewers, subject to various recruitments that were not announced in terms of their true intent. And just as a point of clarification as we get into the question and answer period.
Yeah, I think, and thank you for bringing it up. I would not suggest that legacy media it doesn't get manipulated. It's just a different bar. The money that it costs to do it, the influence that you have to wield was a little bit more naked in the sense that, you had to have access to reporters. What is introduced by social media, and for a long time, we just thought of social media as additive to our information environments. I actually think it constitutes the core of our information environment now. So it has moved from the periphery to the center. And in doing so, I think there's three things I would say that are fundamentally different, which is distribution. No longer are newspaper organizations or organizations we traditionally call newspapers, but the New York Times is probably not best described as that anymore. The Washington Post, for instance. But those kinds of multi-million-dollar organizations and operations are now subject to distribution by other means,
Mhm.
mostly distribution that's out of their control. Also, it's fragmentation, not just fragmentation of the audience, but fragmentation of the form, where you would get you'd get, your straight news, you'd get your opinion, you'd get your sports, and you would get a, a compilation of things, and you would browse through that. Right now, the way it's built is, you like one thing, I'm going to show you 100 versions of that one thing. And it's going to be up to you to figure out what of those is true and correct and what isn't. And I'm going to make it hard for you to see what the labels are. I'm going to make it hard for you to see what the context is. I'm going to make it even triply as hard for you to figure out why you got that information and not something else.
Yeah.
And so the things that are garbage, the things that lack, good monetization strategies, tend to float to the top because people click on them a lot because they're not behind a paywall. So things that have quality, things that cost money, tend to be sidelined by the actual design of social media and search. And then the last thing is, targeted advertising and targeting online introduces isolation of political opportunities. You can refine your message and go deeper rather than having to sort by zip code, for instance. And so that kind of layering and segmentation we saw in 2016. Some ads were being targeted at white voters that were looked as if they were content made by Black Lives Matter. And the point was to fire them up. The point was to get them angry at a whole nother group of people that they might have never really thought a lot about. I mean, let's be honest, white people don't think a lot about race, right? But that isolation of political opportunities and that weaponization then of the platforms was a really big game changer, because now, in some ways, and I use this word really, in a kind of cheeky way, but you've democratized propaganda at
Yeah.
that point, and that spread at scale. We're seeing it now when you go outside, and some entire communities will be wearing masks, and other communities you show up and you're like, it's 10 minutes away. But for some reason, the way in which information is landing in that community, including timely, local, relevant information, is not, eh, eh, you know, um, it doesn't seem to be as potent as the misinformation and as the stuff that is more disruptive.
Well, thank you for that answer. And I think this idea of the kind of individualization or democratization of propaganda as a fact that an individual can do more in terms of communicating with a mass audience than it ever before, helps me understand a lot of what's different about this moment for sure. Um, Let me grab a question from our Q&A, and let's see. We have a question from Artish Matthew, who writes that COVID-19 seems to have created this highly desirable environment for disinformation, as is evidenced by the coalition formed by the anti-vaxxers, the militia Boogaloo Men, the QAnon, etc. As someone who tries to study the QAnon phenomenon, which is becoming a living, mutating conspiracy, is there a useful framework to explain / understand how these disinformation / conspiracy campaigns morph and expand to increase their footprint? How does the movement decide to pivot based on what sticks? So I think that has something to do with not only the kind of contagion of the narrative, but also maybe something that's different with QAnon in terms of its particular form of opportunism, in terms of what it connects, what it mobilizes, and so on.
Yeah. So one of the frameworks that I've been drawn to in working with my sort of like my left brain here, Brian Friedberg, is thinking about it more like a fandom community than thinking about it as a movement. There are people who have favorite narratives, they have favorite characters. The practice of sort of writing into the story, of going around and collecting different clues throughout the internet and then trying to piece things together in a community of folks. It has a lot of hallmarks of, the work that Henry Jenkins has been doing for years. Wouldn't pretend to not know who Henry Jenkins is at this point. But the point, I think, is that it doesn't start like a movement starts. It's not a call to action and a bunch of people who are organizers who some people trust, saying like, we're going to go out in public square and we're going to grow our ranks and we're going to make a platform and we're going to, like raise awareness. I was just about to say raise hell. And then I just did. But I think, I can't remember where I said this, but it might have been the New York Times article, or maybe it's in this piece I'm writing for MIT Tech about QAnon. But for me, there's a couple of key features here. One is that it's extensible, one is that it's adaptable, and one that it is resilient. And so this group, because it is able to weave breaking news into its own conspiracy, it's always fresh and new. There's always something going on. Did you hear Trump mention JFK? That's a clue. Did you hear, this thing about Hunter Biden? That's a clue. And so there's always something new to discover, to work into the theory. It's adaptable in the sense that if there are pieces of it you don't really like, there's enough of everything else that's going on that you can kind of dig in. And that adaptability has also made it resilient in the sense that there have been several different iterations of takedowns on platforms to get rid of it. And the first one in August by this is serious business, right? We got what is described as a militarized social movement by Facebook being handled by their dangerous organizations team, which makes me wonder, is there more to this that we don't know? And they are trying to take it down and they can't. And they can't take it down fully. And when this group gets a handle on that they are going to be removed or deplatformed, they go dark. They do what is called we go camouflage. I'm sure you know this. And they really, in one fell swoop this summer, were able to integrate and blend into the small, world of Save the Children. And it's always going to seem like a magic trick to me that some people, not just some people, but a good deal of people thought that during this pandemic, the most important thing they could do would be to go out in public and protest and rally to save the children. Like that to me is a bizarre outcome of a conspiracy theory, but that's where my work as an ethnographer in movements for several years before I got into this biz really, when you study social movements and you talk to people who are organizers, it takes a lot to get up on a Saturday afternoon and go to a protest. I know it seems like you watch it on TV and it seems like, oh, it's a party. It is exhausting. It's a lot. It is an actual commitment. And so when I see that happening in ways that people are being mobilized by misinformation, I have to wonder, like, how potent is this? Where are they getting these messages? How much of it is invited and participatory? We have a newsletter called Me More Weekly where we talk a lot about memes. And one of the ways in which we see memes proliferate is because of their participatory nature. Anybody can kind of step in and remix and become part of the party. But with this conspiracy, QAnon has got these features of a networked social movement, but also these features of a fandom community. And because they work with breaking news as their puzzle, there's always something to discover and solve. It's a really unique phenomenon. I think for years, many people wrote it off as just absolute, like, ludicrousness, because that's essentially what it's based on. But I think it's being dealt with by the dangerous organizations team specifically because of the anti-Semitic themes and the linking up with the militia groups.
Yeah, this raises this question that about the fascination and the attraction to the most extreme versions of a narrative. And I don't know if you followed, there was a Frontline documentary earlier this fall that dealt with the InfoWars team as they were trying to help Trump coming into the 2016 election. And it was kind of a retrospective conversation with many of the people that were working in that, at that point, YouTube kind of venue in which, you know, they kind of were practicing saying that, like, whatever you see is happening in the world, the opposite is actually true. And, you know, it was partly a kind of game and partly a thing. But what really struck me in the way that they were kind of retrospectively among the staff members thinking about it was that the more extreme the narrative got, the more money they made on the website. That, like, essentially, you know, when they started to get into a world where they were denying that several shootings had happened, pretending that the victims were play actors instead of victims, and so on, that there was something in the way in which that narrative functioned both on the website and for viewers that was had a kind of irresistible force to it. And part of the irresistible force, and why even when they were members of that team were very uncomfortable with the implications of what they were doing, was just it made so much money in the way in which the YouTube algorithm functioned in terms of capturing advertising dollars. So I wonder if you had any kind of thoughts about that example as something that we're now like in a next stage iteration of the development of those kind of modes of organizing desire and interest and recruitments, let's say, where people can do this in a kind of non-serious way and still have it quite affect their view of the world by their viewing practices, their reading practices, their feeds, and so on.
Mhm. Yeah. So one of the things that I wrote about earlier, I can't remember, maybe it was September, August, about the notion of riot porn and like what function it was serving over the summer. So there were a bunch of YouTube influencers, amateur photographer, videographer folks that were going from protest to protest. And for the most part, they would do these 5-hour live streams and they would just be everything that happened, very boring. And then there would be some punctuated moment of violence. And what they would do is they would quickly clip that piece of their media and start recirculating it on Twitter and on Facebook. And over time, there started to become, even in the algorithms, a mixtape of violence carried out at protests. And you could pick your flavor. You could look at, you know, protesters hit by cars, protesters, pepper sprayed, protesters, kettled by police. All of these different things were starting to get sorted and reshuffled and recommended back to me because my computer thinks I'm a white supremacist. And as I was looking at it and I was trying to understand why this was happening, I also was looking at the kinds of media that were being shared through different channels. And this is during, some of you will remember this, some of you won't, but there was a kind of minor event called Chaz Chop, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, the Capitol Hill occupied protest. And this was just a very small protest group in this area of downtown Seattle. And it was always on content. So you got a lot of content for very little time and energy for these live streamers. But the amount of coverage it got on the right wing was 6 times as much as it got in center and left media combined. And this is because the way in which that part of the protest was being narrated was to show that, and this is where we start to see the blurring of the lines between Black Lives Matter and Antifa, was to demonize these people, several of which were already living on the streets and other people who had been, made homeless by the pandemic. And there was, like the Occupy movement, there was a lot of chaos. There was a lot of chaos. But it created this feedback loop amongst people on the right that they were more fluent in what was happening there than even people who were interested in the protest or the national protests. And I bring that up to say that there are times when certain narratives like that trade up the chain and become useful, and they're kind of a hit every time. And so violence at protests is a hit every time. And so as a result, you start to see this same thing happening over and over and over again. The rioting that was happening, the narratives about outside agitators, these happen every time there's some kind of uprising. And I say all of that to say that the term crisis actors was something that was really coined and honed by Alex Jones and InfoWars over time, where if you look at Google Trends, anytime there's some kind of mass shooting event or some kind of mass violence, you'll see a spike in Google searches for crisis actors. And what that tends to do is, because there's so much footage of it and there's so much media to explore around it, that people will watch literally frame by frame videos of things shot in that moment. And Parkland's a really good example of this. And then they will make up the story. It reminds me of this documentary. Oh my goodness, I'm gonna forget the name of it, but it was about Remix, and it was about part of it was about this group called Negativland, who had realized that they could sell their albums if they just called their album U2 and made that a really big font, and made Negativland really small and made it look like Negativland was the name of the YouTube the U2 album. And of course, when their album hit record stores, people thought there was a secret U2 album, and then they got it home and it was just like weird noise, and they were just like, I don't get it. But there's ways in which sloganing and branding were playing into this. And even with the Parkland moment around crisis actors, the fact that the moment David Hogg gets on CNN, the first thing he needs to say to Anderson Cooper is, I'm not a crisis actor. I don't know what's going on. And that's because of the way in which this narrative he had been kind of forced into, but he could not ignore. And I think that that's one of the things that we have to realize about social media. Sometimes it produces these narratives that do not reflect reality, and then they create a reality, though, that we can't ignore. And then some people suffer in ways that they shouldn't have to. And it also mobilizes in the argument about riot porn, as I say, it actually has been mobilizing these militia groups who are, out in the middle of their town late at night, pretending to be the police and trying to patrol. And so there are these strange confluences that I think with the casebook, if we can document enough pattern, I think we'll get somewhere where we can land some policy around internet and content moderation, and move on from this moment, so that people are not forced to try to decipher the truth, that they know what they're getting.
Yeah, that's a huge project right now. And Alex Jones at InfoWars, of course, was kicked off of YouTube for precisely spreading such mistruths. But I was fascinated when he was in the courtroom defending himself against the charges that he had denied, that incredible acts of violence had actually happened. That his defense was to say that he had a psychological condition in which he thinks everything in the world is fake, and therefore he can't be held accountable for acting on that, because he presented it almost as a kind of cognitive disability.
We were seeing a very similar thing with white supremacists that had committed crimes in Charlottesville, and they wanted the posts they had made online excluded because those were just satire, according to them. I was just making a joke. I didn't know it was going to be a horribly violent thing that I had brought weapons to, right? And so those kinds of discursive shifts, right? What it reveals is you actually know what you're working with. Then you know that this person is not exactly who they say they are, and their intents aren't what they mean them to be.
Exactly. Exactly. Let's see. I'll have another question for you here from the chat here. Gaia Rains writes in, many thanks for your incredibly interesting talk. The UN has recently put forward a new roadmap for digital cooperation that seeks to foster greater internet governance, and its subsidiary entities such as the UN Women are pursuing new activities to combat digital violence against women. As someone who's working in this project, what tactics could be taken to increase the success of efforts to influence and create behavior change at a global level? How can international organizations tap into combating the misogynistic extremism that proliferates on websites such as 4chan or pornography sites? And we have a couple of questions in the chat dealing with this idea of this question of misinformation as not a US based problem, but something that's functioning kind of globally. And so this might also be an opportunity to think about, or for you to comment on if you'd like, the relationship between what you're seeing right now in the US and things that are operating in different scales globally and so on.
You were really asking me to stretch my brain today. You know it's after 7, right?
I know.
Come
I
on.
know.
Come on. Come on. Okay.
That's why we went global on you right now.
I know. It's like, oh man. No, I think it's really important. And that's why when we were designing the casebook, what we were trying to do is come up with a framework so that other civil society organizations, technologists, other journalists could easily understand that these are the elements of the story you need to look for in order to tell a fuller picture about how these abuses and harms have occurred, who they have harmed, who was part of the process of that distribution, and then whose responsibility, or, as I argued in my presentation, who ends up having to pick up the mess. And quite right to say that in this moment, women's groups, civil society groups have to shoulder that. And I have a guide out on the case. It's great. Everything's on the Casebook website. I'd been like shoehorning things into Medium, hiding things in my bed, publishing in NBC, like just trying to get everything out there. But I have a guide for civil society organizations. And one of the tactics that I love that I think is really great comes from a conversation that I had with Audrey Tang, who's the digital minister in Taiwan. And her point was very clear. They use this tactic called humor over rumor, and they employ comedians. And when dangerous rumors come out that involve misinformation, medical misinformation, rumors about corruption in government, these kinds of things, they they come at them with a meme very quickly, and they try to get into the flows of where that misinformation is traveling, and then they just outsmart it. They just are funnier, more impactful, visually more fun and interesting. They use a dog. One of the people that works in one of the offices has this Shiba Inu, and the dog is just always ready for a new picture. So it's like, so in situations where humor over rumor might work, go there, try it. With the stuff around dealing with this on a global level, I hate to sound like an anthropologist, but every piece of disinformation is local and it's contingent. And sometimes, if it hasn't touched your community in any meaningful way, if you engage with it, you make the problem worse, especially if you're a high status organization, because if you engage with it, you lend it credence, you give it credibility, and it can then trigger a media cycle where journalists start covering that. And sometimes journalists are very good at playing with the narrative itself, and they use what we call the truth sandwich, which is fact, fallacy, fact. Right. And so they try to state what's true. They try to state the misinformation and why it's wrong and what the motives were, and then state what's true again. And so there are ways that you can combat media manipulation, disinformation campaigns. And my feeling on this is it's best done coalitionally, especially if it's medical misinformation. But when we're talking about extremism and misogyny, that also usually has elements of harassment. And so there are other avenues in which people can capture data, especially if you're subject to a networked harassment campaign. And then unfortunately, we're in the situation where if you want to flag it for platform companies, they have made the process so odorous to report, if 60 people start attacking you online or they're attacking your organization, you have to flag every single piece on its own individually. And that is just not fun. I had this horrible experience once. I'll go down memory lane for you guys. YouTube, a YouTuber didn't like me, decided they were going to talk about me on their program, and said some really disgusting things about me. And then started talking about really heinous things related to child, pedophilia and things. And it was a bear to listen to, but I had to listen to it because I was really afraid they were going to say the address of where I worked, because I had been getting some emails and other kinds of threats. And I knew that I couldn't subject my coworkers to this because I didn't want them to have to listen. And I knew that I had to listen. And so I sent an email over to YouTube and I was like, listen, hey, we know each other a little bit. Check out this video. Like, this guy's saying some terrible things about me. He's like, well, you know what you got to do is you got to timestamp it and then you got to transcribe it. And then you got to send it to us so that we know that what they were saying was specifically about you. And I was just like, F this, F you, I'm out of here. I hate this place. And they were like, okay, we'll take it down. We'll take it down. And then what they did was they gave the creator a privacy strike. And I was the only person they named in the video. So it was obvious that I had complained. So they gave me a nickname. And now I will forever live with a disgusting nickname. But that's all to say that I think there's room for organizations to push for better rules, better enforcement, group reporting, so that we can start to clean up the information environment. And that right now, unfortunately, there's nobody else out there. The protest slogan, "Who keeps us safe? We keep us safe," is very true. It's very true. And so I work with a group of women researchers who often try to help each other figure out what's happening. And if we see something, we alert each other to what's going on. Um, but I wish it didn't have to be that way.
Absolutely. Humor over rumor is an incredible approach in general. Let's see, I've got a couple more questions here. Let's see, I'll take the second part of one question, which is about your thoughts about deplatforming extremists accounts on social media platforms, and what the logic is around that. And I guess that's kind of the related to your comment here about when you reproduce content, you can be amplifying it. Is deplatforming a kind of inverse version of some kind of encouragement to content that is there a downside to that, I guess, would be one question. Maybe I'll let you answer that and then I'll read you we have a longer question coming.
Yeah, I think when we talk about deplatforming, we have to realize that by and large, the people who are abusing these platforms and abusing all of our free speech are recognizable. Their name is their brand. A lot of them are making money doing this. And so when we talk about deplatforming someone like Milo Yiannopoulos, where is that ghost? Where is he? Right? Because he had really set a trap for Twitter, knowing that they would remove him, knowing that he was making a lot more money and getting a lot more attention through Facebook and YouTube. And it was a good way to create media hype as being this banned man. Laura Loomer, where is that ghost, right? I mean, actually, she did win the Republican nomination, but I think it had to do with the fact that not many other people were running. But when it comes to deplatforming, you have to understand that there's a very perverse incentive structure built into these platforms. Very similar to, Joe, you'll probably remember shock jocks in the 80s and 90s, which is if you can say things that are disgusting, if you can say things that upset people, if you can get a slap on the wrist from the big ups at the radio station, you're cool. And like these guys, some of them want to be cool. The ones that I really worry about are the ones that do this anonymously, that are organizing in DM groups and in private Facebook groups, that are slowly mobilizing and are peeling off people who are wayward, who are confused, who are asking questions, right? If we think about the way in which Dylan Roof found Stormfront and the Council of Concerned Citizens, he entered that fora through Google search for Black on white crime, right? And so when we think about deplatforming, it can't just be thinking about individuals. We actually have to think about the entire strategy of curation online and say, are there places in which we want to ensure that when people search for white nationalism, Black on white crime, that they get information that is true and correct and vetted by librarians? Or do you want them to bump into any old Nazi? And it's really important to understand what the difference is, because some people get popular because they're producing those ideas. And because social media has built this reputation of not being able to look at itself, and the algorithms do the work and we don't get involved. And, it's like almost like listening to some weird, artisanal person trying to sell you something like never been touched by human hands, right? Like when they're talking about the production of these algorithms. And to some degree, yeah, the same algorithm that'll send you 150 Yankee Candle reviews back to back to back to back is the same one that's going to send you videos about militias and how to get involved. And so I think it's important that we look at those who are incentivized to do and say terrible things, and then also think about the structure of content curation itself. I wrote a piece for Wired, I don't even know anymore, earlier this year about needing to hire 10,000 librarians to solve the content curation problem. Because if you actually solve it on the front end of the query, then you don't necessarily end up with so many people ending up at these other extreme ends.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And the idea that without the curation, there is the opportunity for a kind of spiral of increasing extremist content based just on interest and attention. That like you don't platform at one level of interest, like you are offered up on many of these platforms similar but more intense versions of the same narrative to keep you online. Seems to me to be a different kind of problem. And it leads into maybe what will be, I think, probably our concluding question, which has to do from Maxwell, who writes, you spoke a lot about the importance of influence today. Online news publishers like Vox, the New York Times, BuzzFeed, and many others have in-house ad agencies that create advertisements that closely resemble news articles, oftentimes referred to as native advertisements. Since the early 20th century, publishers have separated advertising and journalistic content to demonstrate their independence from advertisers, but these relatively new forms of content are breaking these norms. What do you think about native advertising campaigns? Are they something we should be worried about from a media manipulation perspective? If so, does this change the way we think about the legitimacy of quote unquote trustworthy publishers? So that has to do maybe with the seepage of, persuasive forms into things that are supposed to be more factually oriented, let's say.
100%. One of the things that's really kind of interesting, if you look at I don't think you can divorce the platform from the people who make it. And so I think it's actually important to know who's behind the design. And one of the creators of BuzzFeed wrote it. I think it was maybe an MA thesis or a very long paper on Deleuze. If you're familiar with Deleuze, he's got this notion of the rhizome, which is this kind of mess of roots where you don't actually have an origin point, but where you go in and where you exit, and the routes that you take can be different every time. That's how BuzzFeed is designed, or was initially designed, is there wasn't like a way of entering the website. This is its advantage for social media for so long, is that it was one of the first that said, we're not going to have these consistent themes. We're going to have like things that stand alone that hang together through design. And so listicles were mixing with, cat, like cat listicles about, these hilarious cats. I just can't get enough. And then every like 5 or 6, would be a picture for Friskies, and you just kind of scroll on through. You don't really think about it as being the advertising is part of the article. And in many ways, if you grew up on the web before social media, you actually trained your eyes not to look at anything in the sidebars because of the way websites were traditionally designed. Advertising would be in a banner, and it would be in the sides, and the content would be in the middle, and your eyes would just fuzz out. And you didn't really have to do that. And you can thank Ethan Zuckerman for inventing the pop-up window.
That guy.
Yeah, that guy. He also gave us the cute cat theory, and he's got a wonderful project on the way for digital public infrastructure. So he gets a redemption narrative. Some of these other guys in the social dilemma, they don't get a redemption narrative. But I bring that all up because I think I agree with you in the sense that, yeah, like the way in which advertising has become part of the fora of our online experience makes it really hard for us when we have to beg and plead Facebook to mark advertising as sponsored content. And one funny story about Bloomberg, because I was really toggling between giving you a really funny presentation about memes and then talking about this garbage. I went with this garbage because this garbage is new. The old garbage still stinks. But Bloomberg was really smart in the sense that he had many dollars and nobody was going to vote for him. And so what he tried to do was leverage the influencer economy by paying directly Instagrammers to put content in their streams about him. And then all the Instagrammers did was at the bottom of it said, sponsored by Mike Bloomberg. And if you look at the content that they inserted for Bloomberg, it did worse than every other thing that they've done on, there were no real likes and hearts and whatnot. And then a lot of people were like, you sold out. This is dumb. Right. And that kind of strategy, though, because it was so, kind of, you couldn't even tell if the Instagrammer was even going to vote for like Bloomberg or anyone. But it was just such a co-option and an invasion. And it reminded me of, there's this great movie out. I talked with the author last night, Arthur Jones, or not the author, but the director, about it. It's called Feels Good Man, and it's a history of Pepe. It tells about 20 years of the history, or I guess 15 years of the history of Pepe. And the point that he's trying to make with this movie is essentially that when we start to mix up all the genres and we start to mix up all the different things, something as simple as a cartoon icon can become this horrible representation of smugness and grotesque, bullying for trolls, and at the same time be this liberatory thing for activists in Hong Kong. And when we think about the way in which the internet recontextualizes, decontextualizes, we have to think about the role that advertising is playing, because last thing I'll say on this is that, the entire internet backbone is advertising. The metadata structure of search is primarily built for advertising. And, Sophia Noble goes through this in incredible detail in Algorithms of Oppression. But I do think that it does affect not just the trustworthiness of publishers, but erases in many ways the trustworthiness of the environment, which then affects everything in it, including academic papers that we've seen be weaponized during COVID-19, including newspapers or high standard, news organizations that have high standards, academic institutions, law enforcement, our election. And so I think that the entire information media ecosystem right now is seriously under duress, and we're going to see it leveraged. Good news is, there's other people smarter than us that are going to figure out how to make this life more pandemonium than it was before. And so it's up to us. I think, I say this a lot, but the truth needs advocates. People need to get out there and be good information stewards. And it's unfortunate the responsibility is falling on those of us that really still care about the stakes of our information environment and do not want our grandmas to die because they were subject to such horrible nonsense.
Well, thank you, Joan. And, I think one of the things that your talk brings home to me is just that we're also talking about a world of techniques and efforts that can all be understood, and they can be identified, as people who interact with media, but as also, citizens that are engaged in maintaining, the quality of discourse. And so, I urge everybody to go to your website and to get the guidebook on how to understand media manipulation. And on behalf of everybody that's, on the call, I wish we could give you the applause that we would normally lay on you right now.
Come and get it. I'm going to come and get it. We're going to uninvent social media, and then I'm coming to Chicago.
Okay, fantastic. Well, you're always welcome in Chicago, and we hope to have you back online or in presence soon. Good luck in these next few weeks with all the work around the election and the vast media space that needs some attention right now. And I think with that, we are right at time. So I will just thank you so much for a terrific talk and presentation, and thank you for working with this format. And thanks to everybody who logged on to the talk today, and come back to 3CT. Look for more conspiracy/theory projects as the year goes on. And thanks again, Joan, for a really great talk.
Thank you. And if people want to check out the comic that we made about media manipulation, disinformation, check out misinfographics.net. It's drawn by Liz Prince, and it's a stunner. I loved working on that project.
It's great. And we have these links now currently in the chat. So please do check in with those before you go. So thank you, Joan. We'll see you again soon.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.